I am thrilled to do this because, like Pastor said, when you go back and you look at what God has done in your life, it's just a miracle. In my life, I feel like it's such a work of God's grace. And honestly, I'm excited to share it with you. I really am. Some of you that are here might remember my parents. My dad's been gone about 4 years, my mom a longer time. But they remembers here. But the fact is, I did not grow up in a Christian home. My parents had some Christian background, but growing up, I remember only a few rare occasions where they actually did take me to church. But my grandparents lived close by, and occasionally, when I would spend the night with them, they would take me to church with them at North Baptist Church in Flint. Now, I was only about 5 or 6 at the time, so frankly, I wasn't tuned in on the pastor's sermons, and I don't remember what they were. And I'm sure that I slept through every one of them, because I remember at the end I would say, "Was I good today?" And she'd say, "Yes, you were good today." But I do remember everything about that experience. I remember the outside of the church. It had a lot of stained glass windows. I remember the parking lot. I remember the inside of the church. It was red. And I remember sitting with my grandparents and trying to be quiet. And I even remember walking out with them when they would leave and shake the pastor's hand, because I stuck to them because I was so afraid of getting lost. It was, you're little, you just don't want to get lost. But even though I think about that, and I was only 5 or 6 years old, and I only went to church, I'm going to say maybe 7 times a year at most. But that experience of attending church made an indelible impression on my mind and my heart. So much so that going even occasionally, remember, I was only 5 or 6, those Sundays, and this is confession, for it's good for the soul, those Sundays that I wasn't in church, I felt this heavy weight of shame and guilt that I was not in church. It really worked on my conscience. And so I'm going to be honest with you. I'm really embarrassed to admit this, but this tells you what a sinner I was. I pretended to be in church on the days that I wasn't in church. So my neighborhood friends, I grew up in the inner city of Flint when I was young, and they would knock on the door, and I can't believe my mother did this, really, but I'd say, "Don't answer the door." And she'd say, "Don't answer the door." I'd say, "No, don't answer the door." And then later on in the afternoon, when it was safe to go outside, they'd say, "Where were you?" And I'd say, "Well, I was in church." Can you believe that? What a liar I was. I can't even believe that, but I did. I said that. And so I would go out and I would tell them that. But that's how ashamed I was at not being in church. Now, I also want you to know that my parents were good parents. They loved me. I felt loved. I had a good upbringing. It's just that they had no interest in spiritual things. So a few years later, when I was in the 4th grade, my parents moved. They wanted to move to the suburbs, a little different school district, and so I had to make new friends. And God made that very easy for me, because down the street was a neighborhood family, 3 doors down, and they had 5 children. 3 were about my age, and they had a swimming pool. And it was summer, and it was hot, and so I went down there. I was there all the time, and I didn't even know how to swim. But this lady decided she was going to teach me how to swim, so she did. And she gave me a weekly swimming lesson. I'll never forget it. I mean, we started out with the basics, so she was just involved in my life. But what's really wonderful about this family is they went to church all the time. They were in church Sunday mornings, and they went to church Sunday nights, and they went to church Wednesday nights. And they always invited me. And of course, I wanted to go to church, so I went with them. Every time my parents said it was okay that I could go, I went. I heard the gospel clearly preached. And actually, I felt guilty that I was not saved, because I knew I needed to be saved. And this whole family was genuinely concerned for my salvation. In fact, on the rides to church, they would say, "Gail, when are you going to get saved?" And I just, said, "Well, I'm not ready yet." That's what I said. I suppose, as I even recounted this, I must have been the prayer request of this family a lot, probably even the whole church. But truthfully, the reason I decided to avoid that, getting saved, was because I felt afraid and I felt alone in making that decision. Well, a few years later, I was in junior high, and our church, we had a lot of activities for the youth, and I attended a youth roller skating event, and the gospel was clearly presented there, and I couldn't stand it any longer. I actually skated my way when the invitation was given. I mean, if you can do it any faster than that, I don't think you can. And I skated my way to a youth worker who opened the scriptures. In fact, this dear lady passed away yesterday, and then I thought about that. But she opened the scripture, said, Gail, do you want to be saved? I really do. And she clearly showed me from the gospel how to get saved and helped me to really understand the experience. I prayed, God, forgive me for my sins. I knew I needed a Savior, and I was just so thrilled. I was finally saved. I knew that I was a child of God. I was in His family, and it was just an exciting experience. I'll never forget it. Of course, my neighborhood family was beyond excited that, a few years later, I finally came to know the Lord, and I got saved. And my friends in the youth group encouraged me. Now, they're going to give an invitation on Sunday, and if you really, what you should do is you should go forward to make that public. And you know what? They sat around me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I sat in the third row, and they all sat around me, and they supported me. I'll never forget that. And I went forward, and the pastor prayed with me, and I told him what I did, and he gave me a booklet. And I went home, and I remember running upstairs, my bedroom's upstairs, and I filled out this booklet, and I answered every question, so I could fill it out. And then I did what you shouldn't do. I came downstairs the next morning, and I preached a sermon to my mom and dad, and told them how you need to be in church, and you need to get saved. Well, that didn't go over very well, and I don't advise doing that. So I continued to go to church faithfully with this family, who was my adopted family down the street. And I have precious, vivid memories. And as I recalled this, even gathering this testimony together, they had one of those 15-passenger vans. You remember those that a lot of families used to drive? And it was maroon. And I would sit in my living room, and I would wait for them to come and pick me up. It was just a wonderful time. They always loved me. They were always there. It's like, here comes the big van, and I can go to church. This family invested a lot of time in me. It was a time, kind of a dark time in my family's life, but when I would go down there to talk to Hilda, and Hilda she was always available, the door was always open, but as I recounted this, the rest of the family was the same way. Whenever I knocked on the door or rang the doorbell, they were always glad to see me. Gail's here, Wouldn't you just get kind of tired of that pesky neighborhood kid that comes to the door? But they never were. They were just always glad to see me. But I'll never get over God's grace in giving me this neighborhood family down the street who, because they were faithful to the Lord, it changed my life forever. Another blessing that came from this church were godly youth sponsors. I can't say enough about them. Being in my youth group was like being in another Christian family. I went to weekly Bible studies at our youth pastor's house, and he'd have round circle discussions on what are you reading in the Word, and what are you learning in the Word, and what's the Lord doing in your life this week. I went to every youth gathering that I could, whether it was a regular youth group meeting or a get-together at someone's house or a youth retreat. There was one youth retreat, and we went to in Lapeer, and it had a lot of cement steps, and I tripped, fell, and I sprained my ankle. They took me to the emergency room, did the x-rays, but of course that was the end of my retreat, and they took me home, and I was kind of really bummed because I couldn't finish out this retreat. Now remember, back then there's no cell phone, there's no texting, you don't know what anybody's doing. Well, the next morning, one of these couples showed up at my mom and dad's house where I was at, and they asked if they could take me back, crutches and all. I couldn't even believe it. I was so happy, but the dedication, and I watched my mom's face. She's like, I don't know, she's on crutches, she's going to be going up and down stairs, and I thought, is my mom and dad, are they going to say yes or not? And they did, because this youth group, this couple, said, we will take good care of her. And I suppose that was the turning event that they said yes. So I was a happy camper. Another real blessing I had was the opportunity to attend summer church camp. And, we talk a lot about that here, but for someone that comes out of an unsaved home, it's a game changer. because you're with all Christian environment, you're with solid preaching, you're away from your unsaved environment, and it really was just made a huge defining impact in my life. Well, we're going to fast forward. I can't give you my whole life story, but fast forward about 15 years. I'm in my early 30s, and tragedy hit our family. I went through a very painful, horrible, unwanted divorce, something I never planned for in my thoughts at all. And to say that life was a struggle then is the grossest understatement of all time. All of a sudden, I found myself, I'm a single mom. I have to support myself and my little girls, and I have to work a full-time job. But it was then that I really experienced God's provision for us. The ways that God showed himself faithful, there are too many to share with you. We'd be here all night, but there's one that I want to share it just showed me how big my God really was. It was after Christmas, and a support check didn't come. It was a lot of paperwork. It's a long story. But I had 3 definite needs, which were I needed food, I needed some groceries, I had some money set aside to make my mortgage payment, but I didn't have enough, and Molly needed shoes. You know, I gotta tell you, I can still see the shoes. They had those, the rubber flaps. The flaps were coming out, and, she needed shoes. So I did the math, and I added it up, and I thought, it's going to take about $150. This is groceries to get through the week, and whatever it was to finish my mortgage payment, and Molly needed a pair of shoes. I know that's, back then, 1986, that would cover that. Well, I went to church the following Sunday. I didn't even tell my parents about this need, because I just, you just don't. You just don't tell your parents about everything, and so I didn't. And I went to church the next Sunday, and the pastor called me, said, you need to stop in my office on your way out. So I did, and I thought, what do I do now, And he handed me this envelope, and what do you think was in there? $150. That told me how big my God was, and he took care of every single need. And I could truly depend on God as my husband and my provider, my Jehovah Jireh. Now, you're probably wondering, when did your parents, what's happening? Tell us about how your parents came to know the Lord. Well, during my years as a single parent, my parents traded in their retirement years, actually, it really did, to help raise my 2 girls. They literally gave up their golden years to help us, and help they did. My mom and dad came over every single day to get my girls off to school. My mom came when she broke an ankle, when she broke an arm. I think my dad dragged her in there, but they were there. My mom did the laundry. My dad fixed things. My dad was the chauffeur. There wasn't anything they didn't do, but they still weren't in church. And so it was December one year, and Molly was taking piano lessons, and my dad sometimes would be the chauffeur to that. And I was talking to Molly's piano teacher. And she said, Gail, could I send your mom and dad a Christmas card? I said, well, sure, I think that'd be a good idea, and so she got the address. So she sent them a card. I never saw that card, but the next Sunday, it was the biggest shock of my life. I looked down, and sitting in a pew was my mom and dad, and they were smiling and talking to people, and honestly, you could have knocked me over with a feather. So I asked Molly's piano teacher, what did you write in that card? And you got to hear this. She said, and I'm sure she said it a little nicer, but this is basically what it said. Merry Christmas. Your grandchildren need their grandparents to be in church with them. Now, not many people would be that bold in a Christmas card, but I am so grateful for the boldness that Molly's piano teacher said in that card. And yes, that woman was Patricia Miracle. Now, I really don't have one favorite Bible verse to share with you, but 1 Corinthians 3 kind of sums up my testimony. Now, let me read this to you. Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, and by ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. And now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor, for we are laborers together with God. God used so many people to draw me to himself. He used a grandmother who took me to church when my parents didn't. He used a willing Christian family to faithfully take me to church and love on me. And he gave me caring youth sponsors who were willing to invest in me. And lastly, he set it in the heart of one of my dearest friends to advise my parents about their spiritual life. I can't thank God enough for all those people that he used in my life, and I hope that my testimony is an encouragement to you to be the person or the family that God can use to invest in the life of others. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity.